The earth trembled. Dmitry Volkov pressed his face against the frozen mud, breath catching in his throat as the ground beneath him shuddered with each explosion. Shells screamed overhead, tearing through the gray December sky. Around him, his comrades crawled through the skeletal remains of what had once been a village, shattered walls, collapsed roofs, the twisted metal of farm equipment jutting from rubble like broken bones. "Forward!" The command cracked through the chaos. Dmitry rose, legs heavy, rifle gripped in trembling hands. Smoke hung thick in the air, acrid and choking. Through the haze he could see them, the enemy positions, concrete bunkers nestled in the hillside. His unit advanced in a ragged line, boots squelching through mud and snow. Then he saw it. A figure emerged from the smoke, silhouetted against the gray winter light. But this was no ordinary soldier. The man carried something on his back. Tanks, cylinders, connected to a long nozzle he gripped with both hands. For one frozen moment, Dmitry didn't understand. His mind struggled to process what his eyes were seeing. Then the world ignited. A jet of liquid fire erupted from the nozzle, a streaming arc of orange and yellow that seemed to tear reality apart. The flames didn't just burn, they devoured. They turned the air itself into a furnace. The soldiers ahead of Dmitry, men he'd shared bread with that morning, disappeared into an inferno that made no sound at first, just a terrible whooshing, like the breath of some ancient dragon. Then came the screaming. This is not war, Dmitry thought, frozen in horror, as the flames reached hungrily across the battlefield. This is hell. 3 days earlier, the war had almost felt normal. Normal, if war could ever be normal. Normal in the way that terror becomes routine when you live with it long enough. Dmitry had been with the 127th Rifle Division for 8 months now, long enough to know the taste of fear, the weight of his Mosin Nagant rifle, the particular ache of hunger that never quite left your bones. They were dug in outside a town whose name Dmitry could never remember. Or perhaps he'd never learned it. The towns all blurred together after a while, rubble and snow and the occasional chimney still standing, defiant monuments to lives that had been lived there before the war turned everything to ash and memory. "Volkov, you awake?" Dmitry opened his eyes. Pavel Orlov sat across from him in the dugout, a thin man with a thinner mustache, forever fiddling with something, right now a piece of wire he was bending into shapes. In the dim light of their shelter, carved into the frozen earth and reinforced with salvaged timber, Pavel's face looked gaunt, shadows pooling in his eye sockets. "Couldn't sleep," Dmitry said. "Nobody sleeps," Pavel replied, not looking up from his wire. "Not really. We just close our eyes and wait for morning." It was true. Even now Dmitry could hear the distant rumble of artillery, a constant percussion that had become like breathing. You noticed it only when it stopped. Somewhere above them, snow was falling. Dmitry could hear it, that peculiar silence that comes with snowfall, as if the world was holding its breath. "Letter from home?" Pavel asked, nodding toward the folded paper Dmitry held. "My sister. She says mother is well. She says the garden produced potatoes this year. She says—" Dmitry's voice trailed off. What could his sister really say? What truth could survive the journey from home to the front? "She says everything will be fine when you come home," Pavel finished for him. "That's what they all say." Dmitry carefully refolded the letter and tucked it into his jacket, close to his heart. The paper was soft from being read and reread, the words nearly memorized. "Stay alive, Dimitrushka," his sister had written. "Just stay alive and come home to us." Such a simple request. Such an impossible promise. "Breakfast!" The call came from outside, Sergeant Volodya's gruff voice cutting through the cold. Dmitri and Pavel climbed out of their dugout into the pre-dawn darkness. Around them, the camp stirred to life. Other soldiers emerged from their shelters, breath misting in the freezing air. Someone had gotten a fire going, and over it hung a battered pot containing something that might generously be called soup. "Kasha again," muttered Boris, a broad-shouldered farm boy from Ukraine who somehow still carried weight on his frame when everyone else had been whittled to bone and sinew. "One day I'll eat kasha that doesn't taste like boiled cardboard, and I'll weep with joy." "One day you will eat a bullet," Yuri shot back, "and you'll weep with something else entirely." The men laughed, that bitter gallows humor that soldiers learn when nothing else makes sense. Dmitri took his portion and ate mechanically, tasting nothing. The important thing was the warmth, the calories, the fuel to keep your body moving for another day. "Orders came through," Sergeant Volodya announced, moving among the men. He was older than most of them, perhaps 40, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen too much and survived it through sheer stubbornness. "We advance at dawn. Intelligence says the enemy is reinforcing their positions. We hit them before they're ready." The men nodded. They always nodded. What else could they do? Dmitri thought about his sister's letter, about the potato garden, about a world where the most important thing was whether vegetables grew or didn't grow. That world seemed impossibly distant now, separated from this frozen hellscape by more than mere miles. "You scared?" Pavel asked quietly. "Always," Dmitri said. "Aren't you?" "Terrified," Pavel admitted. "But I figure if I've been terrified for 8 months and I'm still here, maybe I'm doing something right. Or maybe your number just hasn't come up yet?" Pavel's laugh was hollow. "Maybe, but until it does, I'll keep bending wire and thinking about home and pretending tomorrow might actually come." They sat in silence then, watching the sky slowly lighten from black to gray. Around them men checked their weapons, wrote hurried letters they might never send, prayed to gods they weren't sure existed anymore. The ritual of soldiers before battle, ancient as war itself. Dmitri closed his eyes and tried to remember his mother's face. It was getting harder. The war had a way of erasing things, of replacing memories with mud and blood and fear. But if he concentrated, he could still smell her cooking, still hear her humming as she worked in the kitchen. He held on to that, clutched it like a talisman. "Stay alive," his sister had written. The simplest request, the hardest promise. The sky continued to brighten. In an hour they would advance. In an hour everything would change. But for now, in this moment before dawn, Dmitri Volkov allowed himself to hope that he might see one more sunrise after this one. Just one more. The attack began with artillery. It always began with artillery, that terrible overture that announced death was coming. Dmitri pressed himself into a shell crater, hands over his ears, as the world disintegrated around him. The sound was beyond sound, a physical force that crushed thought, that reduced consciousness to pure animal fear. Then, silence. That awful silence that meant it was their turn. "Forward!" Dmitri scrambled out of the crater and ran. Around him, his comrades emerged from cover, a ragged line of men advancing through smoke and snow. The enemy positions loomed ahead. Concrete bunkers and trenches carved into the hillside. Already, machine gun fire was cutting through the air. That distinctive rapid crack sound that meant death traveling faster than sound. Someone fell beside Dmitri. He didn't look. You learned not to look. They reached a drainage ditch and threw themselves into it, gasping for breath. Pavel landed next to Dmitri, face pale, hands shaking as he worked the bolt on his rifle. "They're dug in deep," Boris panted. "We'll never take those bunkers with just rifles." "We have grenades," Yuri said, but his voice carried no conviction. Sergeant Volodya crouched at the edge of the ditch, studying the enemy line through field glasses. His jaw was set, his eyes hard. "We go again in 2 minutes. Stay low, move fast, and—" He never finished. It started as movement, a figure emerging from one of the bunkers. At first, Dmitri thought it was just another enemy soldier. But there was something wrong about the silhouette, something that his brain struggled to parse. The figure wore what looked like tanks on its back and carried a long nozzle connected by tubes to the tanks. "What is that?" Pavel whispered. Then the figure raised the nozzle and pulled the trigger. Liquid fire erupted into existence. That's the only way Dmitri could think of it later. Not that fire was created or ignited, but that it erupted, as if it had been waiting just beneath the surface of reality, waiting for permission to exist. A stream of burning liquid shot across the battlefield in a high arc, and where it landed, hell came with it. The fire didn't just burn, it clung. It splashed across the ground like water, but this water was fury and annihilation. Men caught in its path became pillars of flame, human candles that stumbled and fell and kept burning. The smell hit Dmitri a second later, burning fuel, and underneath it something worse, something that made his stomach heave. Burning flesh, burning hair, burning men. The screaming started. It was unlike any sound Dmitri had ever heard. These weren't the cries of wounded men, sharp and agonized, but still human. These were sounds torn from throats by pure animal agony, sounds that no human vocal cord should be able to produce. They were the sounds of souls being burned out of bodies. "Fall back," someone was shouting. Maybe Sergeant Volodya, maybe someone else. It didn't matter. The line broke. Men ran. Discipline vanished like smoke. They threw down their rifles and ran, stumbling over each other in their panic to escape the dragon that had been unleashed upon them. Dmitri found himself running too, legs pumping, lungs burning, but all he could see was that arc of flame, that impossible weapon that turned men into torches. He fell into another shell crater and pressed himself against the frozen earth. Around him, chaos. Men screaming, men crying, men praying. Pavel landed beside him, face white as bone, eyes wide and staring at nothing. "Did you see?" Pavel's voice was barely a whisper. "Did you see what it did to them?" Dmitri had seen. God help him, he had seen. He'd seen Yuri, big jovial Yuri who joked about Kasha that morning, transformed into a living torch, his whole body engulfed in flames that seemed to burn from the inside out. He'd seen Yuri take 3 steps, 4, before collapsing into the snow, and still the fire wouldn't stop, couldn't be put out, just kept burning and burning, and— "I'm going to be sick," Pavel gasped, and then he was, vomiting into the crater, his whole body shaking. Another burst of flame arced overhead, close enough that Dmitri could feel the heat, could hear the roar of the fire like the breath of some monstrous engine. Where it landed, snow instantly vaporized into steam, earth turned to slag. And if there were men there? Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't. But he couldn't not think about it. The images were burned into his brain as thoroughly as the fire burned flesh. He could still smell it, that awful smell of cooked meat and charred bone and burning hair. It was in his nostrils, on his tongue, and he knew he would taste it forever.
"We have to move," Dmitri managed to say. "We can't stay here." "Where?" Pavel looked at him with eyes that had seen too much, that had crossed some threshold from which there was no return. "Where do we go when they have that?" It was a good question. Dmitri had no answer. Another soldier tumbled into the crater, and Dmitri recognized young Alexei, barely 18, who had joined their unit just 2 weeks ago. The boy's face was splattered with mud and something else. Blood, maybe. Or the residue of men who'd been standing too close when the fire came. He was sobbing, great heaving gasps, and kept repeating the same words over and over. "They're burning them alive. They're burning them alive. They're burning them." "Shut up." Dmitri grabbed the boy by his shoulders, shook him. "Shut up and breathe. Just breathe." But Alexei couldn't shut up, couldn't stop the words spilling out. And maybe that was better than the alternative. Maybe madness was a mercy when sanity meant facing what they'd just witnessed. The attack lasted perhaps 10 minutes. It felt like hours. It felt like eternity. Wave after wave of liquid fire swept across the battlefield, transforming it into a vision of hell that Dante himself couldn't have imagined. The flames painted everything in shades of orange and yellow and red, colors that should have been beautiful but were instead the most terrible thing Dmitri had ever seen. Finally, mercifully, it stopped. The flamethrowers fell silent. In the sudden absence of roaring fire, the world seemed unnaturally quiet. Even the screaming had mostly stopped. Either the wounded had died, or they'd passed beyond the point where screaming was possible. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, thick and oily, carrying with it the stench of war's newest atrocity. Dmitri forced himself to look over the edge of the crater. What he saw would haunt him for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. Bodies, dozens of them. But they weren't bodies anymore. Not really. They were charred remains, blackened husks that might once have been human. Some were still smoking. Some were twisted into impossible shapes, frozen in their final agonies. Here and there, patches of earth still burned with small, persistent flames, as if the fire had soaked into the ground itself and would burn there forever. "This is not war," Dmitri heard himself say, voice hollow and distant. "This is not war. This is hell." Pavel didn't respond. He sat with his back against the crater wall, staring at nothing, wire forgotten in his hands. Young Alexei had curled into a ball, still sobbing quietly. Around them, the survivors of their unit began to emerge from cover, moving like ghosts through the smoke, faces slack with shock. Sergeant Volodya appeared at the edge of the crater. His left arm hung useless at his side, blood seeping through his jacket, but his eyes were still hard, still alert. "Volkov, Orlov, get up. We're pulling back to the secondary line." "How many?" Dmitri asked. "How many did we lose?" The sergeant's face could have been carved from stone. "Enough. Now move." They climbed out of the crater and began the long walk back through the carnage. Dmitri kept his eyes forward, trying not to see the bodies, trying not to breathe too deeply and taste the smoke that still hung in the air. But it was impossible. The dead were everywhere, and their deaths had been so terrible that even hardened soldiers turned away. Behind them, the enemy bunkers remained silent. They didn't need to fire. Their message had been delivered clearly enough. "This is what we can do to you," those silent bunkers said. "This is the new face of war. This is your future."
And in that moment, stumbling through smoke and ash and the remains of his comrades, Dmitri Volkov understood that something fundamental had changed. War had always been hell. He'd known that since his first week at the front. But this was a new kind of hell, a mechanized hell. A hell so efficient and so terrible that the old barbarities seemed almost merciful by comparison. A bullet killed you. A shell tore you apart. Those were clean deaths, if death could ever be clean. But fire? Fire was different. Fire was alive. Fire was hungry. Fire didn't just kill you, it consumed you, erased you, turned you from a human being into ash and smoke and nothing. "Stay alive," his sister had written. Dmitri touched the letter in his jacket, felt the paper soft against his chest. The request seemed almost laughable now. How could you stay alive when the enemy had weapons like that? How could you fight fire that couldn't be outrun, couldn't be hidden from, couldn't be stopped? You couldn't, that was the answer. You simply couldn't. And yet they would try. Tomorrow or the next day or the day after that, the order would come to advance again. And they would go, because that's what soldiers did. They went forward into hell because someone told them to, because duty demanded it, because to refuse was unthinkable. But tonight they could rest. Tonight they could huddle in their dugouts and try not to think about what they'd seen. Tonight they could pretend that tomorrow might be different, even though they all knew it wouldn't be. The dugout smelled of wet earth and fear. Dmitri sat in the darkness, unable to sleep, unable to even close his eyes. Every time he did, he saw flames. Every time he breathed, he smelled burning flesh. The war had taken many things from him over the past months: innocence, hope, the belief that there was some fundamental decency in the world. But it had left him his memories intact, and now he wished desperately that it would take those too. Outside, men were screaming. Not from battle. The night was quiet, punctuated only by distant artillery that had become like a heartbeat, constant and ignored. No, these screams came from the medical tent, where the doctors worked by lantern light on those who'd been touched by the fire and survived, if survived was the right word. Dmitri had seen them brought in, soldiers with burns covering half their bodies, skin peeling away in sheets, faces melted into masks of agony. The lucky ones were unconscious. The unlucky ones were awake and aware, feeling every moment of their transformation from human to something else, something that resembled the damned souls in old religious paintings. "They're giving them morphine," Pavel said from across the dugout. His voice was flat, emotionless. "But we don't have enough. We never have enough." "Stop talking about it."
"I can't stop thinking about it." Neither could Dmitri. The images were on a loop in his mind, playing over and over with perfect clarity. Yuri, wreathed in flames. Alexei sobbing in the crater. The charred remains scattered across the battlefield like discarded toys. And underneath it all, that smell. That terrible smell that no amount of cold air or distance could erase. "Do you think they knew?" Pavel asked. "The men who made those weapons. Do you think they understood what they were creating?" Of course they knew. But to understand it, Pavel's voice trailed off. To sit in some workshop or laboratory, to design a weapon whose only purpose is to burn men alive, what kind of person does that? Dmitri had no answer. Perhaps the same kind of person who designed bombs to blow children apart, or poison gas to melt lungs, or any of the 1,000 other innovations humanity had devised to murder itself more efficiently. The history of war was the history of new and better ways to kill, and each generation believed their horrors were the worst, the most terrible, the most unforgivable. Maybe they were all right. Maybe every new weapon was the worst, until something worse came along. "I want to go home," Pavel said quietly. "Is that cowardice? To want to leave, to run away, to be anywhere but here?" "If it is, then we're all cowards." "Maybe. But there's a difference between wanting to run and actually running. We're still here, we're still—" He stopped, and in the silence another scream echoed from the medical tent. "God. God help us." But God wasn't helping. God had abandoned this place, if he'd ever been here at all. This was purely the work of men, men and their machines, men and their ingenuity and their infinite capacity for cruelty wrapped in the language of duty and necessity. Footsteps sounded outside, and then Sergeant Volodya ducked into the dugout. His arm was bandaged now, but he moved stiffly, favoring his injured side. He looked older than he had that morning.
older by years, by decades. War aged you like that, not gradually, but in sudden leaps, in moments of trauma that carved lines into your face and hollowed out your eyes. Boris is dead, the sergeant said without preamble. He had burns on 40% of his body, didn't make it through the night. Dmitri felt something cold settle in his chest. Boris, who joked about Kasha. Boris, who was strong and solid and seemingly indestructible. Gone. Just gone. The others? Mikhail will probably lose his leg. Andrei is blind, the flames got his face. Ivan, the sergeant's voice cracked, just slightly, just enough to show that underneath the stone exterior was still a human being, still someone who felt. Ivan is asking us to shoot him. He's burned too badly to survive, but not badly enough to die quickly. He just lies there and begs for someone to end it. And will someone? Pavel asked. Volodya's silence was answer enough. How many did we lose today? Dmitri asked. Total. 43 dead. 21 wounded, most of them burns. Out of a company of 96. The numbers were delivered without emotion, but behind them was an abyss of grief too large to express. Command is calling it a tactical withdrawal. They're saying we'll regroup and attack again in 3 days. With what? Pavel's laugh was bitter. With the dead? Should we dig them up and send them forward? Maybe corpses can fight fire. Enough. Volodya's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. I know what you saw today. I saw it too. But despair is a luxury we can't afford. We're soldiers. We have orders. We'll follow them. Even if those orders mean walking into fire, especially then. The sergeant left, and Dmitri and Pavel sat in silence, listening to the distant screams from the medical tent gradually fade as morphine or death brought release. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet, covering the world in white. By morning, the battlefield would be pristine, all the blood and ash hidden beneath a clean blanket of snow. But underneath, the dead would still be dead. The burned would still be burned. And the living would still carry the memories of what they'd seen. Dmitri took out his sister's letter and read it again by the dim light of a candle. The words blurred as he read. Stay alive, Dimitrushka. Just stay alive and come home to us. How? How could he promise that when every day brought new ways to die? How could he stay alive when the enemy had weapons that turned men into living candles, when every advance meant walking into hell itself? He thought about Boris, dead in the medical tent. He thought about Yuri, burned alive on the battlefield. He thought about Ivan, begging for someone to end his suffering. He thought about all the men who'd marched beside him that morning, men who'd been alive and whole and human, now reduced to ash or agony or nothing at all. I had a dream last night, Pavel said suddenly, before the attack. I dreamed I was home, and it was summer, and my mother was cooking bread. I could smell it. You know that smell when bread is baking? And everything was warm and safe and normal. And then I woke up and I was here, and I realized that home might as well be on the moon for how likely I am to see it again. You'll see it again, Dmitri said, but the words were hollow. Will you? Will you? Or will we end up like Boris, like Yuri, like all the others? Just names on a casualty list, just bodies in unmarked graves, just memories that fade until even our mothers forget exactly what we looked like. I had no answer. There was no answer. War didn't deal in certainties, only in probabilities, and the probability of survival decreased with every day, every battle, every new horror unleashed upon them. Another scream from the medical tent, cut short. Silence. Then sobbing and the murmur of voices trying to comfort the inconsolable. "This is not war," Dmitri whispered, echoing his own words from the battlefield. "This is hell." "No," Pavel replied, voice hollow. "Hell is what comes after. This is just the waiting room." They sat together in the darkness, 2 soldiers among thousands, 2 lives among millions, waiting for dawn and whatever fresh horror it would bring. Outside, the snow continued to fall, indifferent and pure, covering everything in white. But underneath the white, the scars remained. Private James Morrison crouched in his bunker and tried to stop his hands from shaking. He'd fired the flamethrower 3 times today, 3 squirts of liquid fire, each lasting perhaps 5 seconds, 15 seconds total. 15 seconds to end dozens of lives, to transform human beings into things that screamed and burned and died in ways that no one should die. His hands wouldn't stop shaking. "You did good today, Morrison." Lieutenant Parker stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light. "Command is pleased. You broke their attack, sent them running, probably saved a dozen American lives." "Yes, sir," Morrison said automatically. His voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. "You feeling okay?" "Fine, sir." It was a lie, and they both knew it. Morrison wasn't fine. He wasn't sure he'd ever be fine again. Because every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, the enemy soldiers, caught in his flames, transformed from men into pillars of fire. He saw them running, saw them falling, saw them try to pat out flames that couldn't be patted out, that just burned and burned and burned. He'd killed men before. You didn't survive 3 months in combat without killing. He'd shot enemy soldiers, thrown grenades, called in artillery strikes. But those deaths had been clean wasn't the right word. Nothing about death was clean. But they'd been quick, impersonal. You pulled a trigger and someone fell down, and that was that. You could tell yourself it was war, that it was necessary, that it was them or you. But this was different. This was watching men burn alive. This was hearing their screams. This was smelling their flesh cook. This was looking into their eyes as they realized what was happening to them, as they understood that they were going to die in fire and agony, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. "It's a hell of a weapon," Lieutenant Parker said, still standing in the doorway. "The brass is real excited about it. They think it could change the whole dynamic of infantry combat. No more endless stalemates, no more throwing men at bunkers over and over. Just burn them out and move on." Morrison said nothing. What could he say? That he agreed? That he was glad to be the one wielding this new instrument of horror? That he was proud of what he'd done today? "I know it's not easy," the lieutenant continued, his voice softer now. "Hell, I know it's terrible, but this is war, son, and in war, you do what you have to do to survive and help your buddies survive. You think those Russians wouldn't do the same to us if they had the chance?" Maybe they would. Probably they would. But did that make it right? Did it make it any less terrible? "Get some rest," the Lieutenant Parker said. "We might need you again tomorrow." The lieutenant left, and Morrison was alone with his thoughts and the smell of fuel that seemed to cling to him no matter how many times he washed. He looked down at his hands, young hands, 20-year-old hands, hands that had grown up playing catch with his father and helping his mother in the garden, hands that now knew how to reduce human beings into ash. In his pocket was a letter from his mother, received just 2 days ago. She'd written about home, about his younger sister's graduation, about the dog getting into the trash again. She'd written, "I'm so proud of you, Jimmy. I know you're doing important work over there, keeping us all safe. Come home soon." How could he go home? How could he sit at the dinner table and pass the potatoes and pretend he was the same person who'd left? How could he look his mother in the eye, knowing what his hands had done? "Hey, Morrison!" He looked up. Sergeant Davis stood there, a weathered veteran of 35 who'd survived Normandy and the push across France. If anyone understood, it would be Davis. "You okay, kid?" "I don't know, Sarge." Davis nodded slowly, then sat down on an ammunition crate. "First time with a flamethrower?" "Yeah. It's different, isn't it? Different from shooting or grenades." "Yes," Morrison said, relieved that someone understood. I can't stop seeing them, can't stop hearing them." "I know. It's a nasty piece of work, that weapon. Effective as hell, but nasty." Davis pulled out a cigarette, lit it, took a long drag. "You want my advice? Don't think of them as people. Can't let yourself do that. They're the enemy. They'd kill you without thinking twice. You did what you had to do." But Morrison had seen their faces, had seen them as people, as men with families and homes and dreams, men who probably wanted to survive and go home just as desperately as he did. You couldn't just unsee that, couldn't just flip a switch and turn fellow human beings into abstract enemies. "Does it get easier?" Morrison asked. Davis was quiet for a long moment, smoke curling up from his cigarette. Finally, he said, "No. It doesn't get easier, you just get harder, and I'm not sure that's better." They sat in silence, two soldiers on opposite sides of youth and experience, both carrying burdens that no one should have to carry. Outside, someone was singing, an old song from home, something about green fields and blue skies, and a girl waiting by a garden gate. The voice was young and uncertain, trying to remember innocence in a place where innocence came to die. "I joined up because I wanted to make a difference," Morrison said quietly. "I wanted to fight for something, you know, freedom, democracy, all that. I wanted to be brave, to be a hero. And now? Now I just want to survive. Now I just want to get through each day without seeing someone burn alive. Is that cowardice? No, son, that's not cowardice. That's sanity trying to survive in an insane world." Davis crushed out his cigarette. "But here's the thing. You're still here. You're still doing your job. That takes courage, even if it doesn't feel like it." "I don't feel courageous. I feel like a monster." "Maybe we're all monsters," Davis said. "Maybe that's what war does. It turns everyone into monsters, and the only question is whether we can find our way back to being human when it's over." Could you find your way back? Morrison didn't know. He thought about the Russian soldiers he'd burned today, wondered if they'd had letters from home in their pockets, wondered what their mothers had written to them, what hopes and dreams they'd carried into battle. He'd never know. He'd never know their names, their stories, their lives. He'd only know how they died, in flames, screaming, while he pulled the trigger and watched it happen. "The worst part," Morrison heard himself say, "is that I'm good at it. The lieutenant said so. Command is pleased. I'm good at burning men alive." "Then maybe the world has gone completely mad," Davis replied, "when being good at burning people is something to be praised." They sat together as darkness fell, two men trying to make sense of the senseless, trying to justify the unjustifiable. Around them the bunker complex hummed with activity, men cleaning weapons, eating rations, writing letters home that mentioned nothing of what they'd seen or done, everyone pretending that this was normal, that this was acceptable, that this was simply the way things were. But it wasn't normal, it wasn't acceptable, it was hell, plain and simple, and both sides were guilty of creating it. 1 week later, Dmitry Volkov walked through the ruins of another nameless town. The fighting had moved on. His unit, what remained of it, had been pulled back to rest and refit. They'd received replacements for the men they'd lost, fresh-faced boys who didn't yet understand what they'd volunteered for, who still believed in glory and heroism and all the lies that got men killed. Give them a week, Dmitri thought. Give them one encounter with the fire, and they'd understand. The town was empty, abandoned by civilians and military alike. Snow drifted through shattered windows. Wind whistled through collapsed walls. In a small square, a fountain stood frozen. The water turned to ice, forever captured in mid-splash. It was beautiful in its way, this frozen moment, this pause in the endless rush toward destruction. Dmitri sat on the edge of the fountain and took out his sister's letter. He'd read it so many times the paper was falling apart along the folds, the ink fading. He read it again anyway, trying to connect with that other world, that place where people worried about potato gardens and not about burning alive. Stay alive, Dmitrishka. He'd stayed alive, so far, but at what cost? What had he become in the process of surviving? What pieces of himself had he left on that battlefield, on all the battlefields, scattered among the dead and the ash? Pavel found him there, sitting by the frozen fountain. His friend looked older now. They all looked older. War had a way of aging you from the inside out, hollowing you until you were just a shell, pretending to be human. "They're sending us back tomorrow," Pavel said. "New offensive. Command thinks we've rested enough." "Have we?" "I don't think any amount of rest will ever be enough." They sat together in silence, two soldiers in an empty town, surrounded by the ghosts of all they'd witnessed. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. Always artillery. Always that reminder that the war continued, that the killing never stopped, that tomorrow would bring fresh horrors to add to the collection. "I don't dream about home anymore," Pavel said quietly. "I try to, but I can't. All I dream about is fire. Just fire, burning everything, burning us." Dmitri understood. His own dreams had become a parade of flames and screaming, an endless loop of that moment when the flamethrower had first ignited, when hell had been unleashed upon the earth. Some nights he woke gasping, convinced he could smell burning flesh, convinced the walls of his dugout were closing in with fire. "Do you think it will ever end?" Pavel asked. "The war, I mean?" "All wars end eventually. But will we see it? Will we survive long enough to go home?" Dmitri had no answer. Statistics were against them. Soldiers in combat, especially those who'd already survived months of fighting, had shorter and shorter odds with each passing day. The law of averages caught up to everyone eventually. Some died to bullets, some to shells, some to disease or exposure or simple bad luck. And some died to fire. "If I don't make it," Pavel said, pulling out a battered photograph, "will you make sure this gets to my mother? It's the only picture she has of me in uniform." Dmitri took the photograph, looked at the young man captured there, Pavel before the war, before the haunted eyes and the hollow cheeks, before he'd learned what fire could do to human flesh. "Don't talk like that. You'll give it to her yourself." "Maybe, but just in case." They exchanged photographs then, that ritual soldiers performed when they felt death circling closer. Dmitri gave Pavel a picture of his family, his mother and sister, standing in front of their house, smiling at the camera, frozen in a moment of peace that seemed impossibly distant now. "Your sister is beautiful. She looks kind." "She is. She writes to me every week. She still believes I'm coming home." "Maybe you will." "Maybe." But the word carried no conviction. They both knew the truth, even if they couldn't speak it aloud. The odds were stacked against them. The war was a machine that consumed men, and they were just fuel, just bodies to be thrown into the furnace until there was nothing left but ash and memory. A wind picked up, carrying with it snow and the faint smell of smoke. Always smoke now, as if the whole world was burning. Dmitri pulled his coat tighter and tried to remember what warmth felt like when it wasn't the warmth of flames, when it was just sunshine and summer and life. "Do you remember that first day?" Pavel asked, "when we joined up? How we thought we'd be heroes? How we thought war was going to be about courage and honor and defending the motherland?" "I remember. We were idiots. We were young. Everyone's an idiot when they're young." Pavel laughed, a sound without humor. "Young. I'm 23 years old, Dmitri. 23. I should be thinking about girls and jobs and starting a family. Instead, I'm thinking about how I'm going to die. Bullet, shell, fire, which one will get me first?" "Stop it." "Why? It's the truth. We're all dead men. We just haven't stopped moving yet." Dmitri wanted to argue, wanted to insist that they'd survive, that they'd make it home, that this nightmare would end and they'd return to the world of potato gardens and warm kitchens and mothers who worried about ordinary things. But the words wouldn't come, because Pavel was right. They were dead men walking, just too stubborn or too frightened to lie down. "If the fire comes again," Pavel said softly, "promise me you'll shoot me. Don't let me burn. Don't let me die like that." "Pavel, promise me, Dmitri. If I'm caught in the flames, if I'm burning, just end it, please. I can't die like that. I can't." The request hung in the air between them, terrible and sincere. Dmitri wanted to refuse it, wanted to say it would never come to that, wanted to believe in a future where such promises weren't necessary. But he'd seen the burned men in the medical tent. He'd heard their screams. He'd smelled their flesh cooking. And he knew that if he were burning, if he were trapped in that particular hell, he'd want the same mercy. "I promise," he whispered. Pavel nodded, satisfied. They sat in silence then, two soldiers who'd made a pact that both hoped would never need to be honored. Around them, the ruined town slowly disappeared beneath falling snow, nature covering the scars that men had made. Dmitri thought about Private Morrison, the American soldier operating that flamethrower. Did he sleep at night? Did he dream of the men he'd burned? Or had he found some way to justify it, to make peace with what he'd done? Perhaps it didn't matter. Perhaps Morrison was just as much a victim as those he'd killed, a man turned into a weapon, a tool of destruction, who would have to live with what he'd done for however long life lasted. Perhaps they were all victims of something larger than themselves, caught in a machinery of violence that ground everyone down to nothing, regardless of which side they served. "This is not war," Dmitri said, speaking the words that had become his mantra, his truth, his epitaph for everything they'd witnessed. "This is hell." Pavel looked at him, eyes ancient in a young face. "Then I guess we're all damned." "Maybe we are. And if we somehow survive, if we make it home, what then?" Dmitri considered the question. What happened to soldiers who'd been through hell? Could they just return to normal life, to jobs and families, and the mundane concerns of peace? Could you wash away the smell of burning flesh, silence the screams that echoed in your mind, forget the faces of the dead? "I don't know," he admitted. "I think maybe we carry it with us forever. I think maybe part of us stays here, in the mud and the snow and the fire, even if our bodies make it home. Then the war never really ends.
not for us.
No, not for us. They rose and began walking back to their unit. Two figures moving through the snow, leaving footprints that would be covered within minutes, erased as if they'd never been there at all. Behind them, the frozen fountain remained, that monument to a world that had been, a world before fire had become a weapon, before hell had come to earth. The next day they would advance again. The next day they would face the enemy and all his terrible weapons. The next day, some of them would die, to bullets or shells or fire, or simply to the grinding machinery of war that cared nothing for individual lives. But that was tomorrow. Tonight they had shelter and warmth and the bitter comfort of companionship. Tonight they could pretend that morning might never come. The war continued. Men died. Men killed. Fire burned, and bullets flew, and shells exploded, and the great machine of violence churned on, indifferent to the suffering it caused. Flamethrowers became more common, more efficient, more terrible. Other weapons followed. Each generation convinced their innovations were too horrible to use, each generation using them anyway. Dmitry Volkov survived that winter, and the spring that followed, and the summer after that. He survived battles and retreats, advances and stalemates, moments of terror and hours of boredom. He survived when better men died, when braver men fell, when men who deserved to live were cut down while he somehow continued. He never had to honor his promise to Pavel. His friend died in April, not from fire, but from a sniper's bullet, quick and clean and almost merciful compared to the alternatives. Dmitry sent the photograph to Pavel's mother with a letter full of lies about how bravely he'd fought, how quickly he died, how he hadn't suffered. The truth that Pavel had spent 10 minutes bleeding out in a crater, calling for his mother, dying slowly while Dmitry held his hand and lied about how he was going to be fine, that truth stayed with Dmitry. Some truths were too heavy to share. Private James Morrison also survived the war. He returned home to America, to his mother's house and his father's proud handshake and his sister's excited chatter about school. He got a job, got married, had children. He built a normal life, did ordinary things, became just another veteran in a country full of them. But at night, sometimes he woke screaming, and the smell of barbecue always made him sick. And there were moments, usually when he was alone, when he would look at his hands and remember what they'd done, what they'd been capable of, what horrors they'd unleashed. His wife never asked about the war, and he never told her. Some things couldn't be shared, some things couldn't be put into words. Some things just had to be carried, borne in silence, endured until death finally brought release. Decades later, when both men were old, when the war had become history rather than memory for most of the world, when textbooks reduced that vast horror to dates and statistics and strategic analyses, someone would occasionally ask them about their experiences. And both men, separated by oceans and language and ideology, but united in their trauma, would say variations of the same thing. I saw things no one should see. I did things no one should do. War isn't glory. War isn't heroism. War is hell. And if pressed, if asked about the worst moment, the thing that haunted them most, they would mention the flamethrowers, the fire that consumed men, the screams that never stopped echoing across the years. This is not war, this is hell. they would say, echoing words spoken a lifetime ago in frozen trenches and concrete bunkers. And then they would fall silent, lost in memories of fire and smoke, and the terrible knowledge that humans were capable of infinite cruelty, that in the right circumstances, or the wrong ones, anyone could become a monster. The war ended, as all wars do, but for those who'd been there, for those who'd witnessed what humanity could do to itself, who'd seen the fire and survived it, the war never really ended. It just moved inside, burning quietly, consuming them from within, a slow immolation that lasted decades instead of seconds. They carried it with them to their graves. And even in death, perhaps especially in death, the memories remained. Smoke rising, flames dancing, screams echoing across the years. This is not war, this is hell. And hell, they'd learned, wasn't a place you went when you died. Hell was a place you carried with you. Forever.